I've pulled the brake drum. I start by removing the dust cap and then this retainer clip. Some nuts are held in place with this little retainer clip, some are with a cotter pin. And once I get that retainer clip off, then I can pull the nut, and then back here is a big flat washer. Then we pull the bearing off, and then you can get the hub off. And what I've done so far is remove the seal, and that reveals the inner bearing. And looking at the inside of this bearing, I can tell that it has been running hot occasionally because we can see some discoloration inside. There's a lot of shiny spots. And if we look at the outer bearing, we can also see a little bit of discoloration in there, especially right there. That's a great big spot. So I'm going to replace the bearings and the races. First I'll clean out as much grease as I can. Yeah, that's a lot of black grease in there as well. So these bearings were definitely due for a repack. Okay, it just popped out. Okay, that one popped loose. And once I have everything cleaned up better, then I'll go ahead and install the new races. We'll drop it in there with the wide mouth of the cone facing towards us. And I'll assemble my tool here. Drop that in place. It feels like it's fully seated, and I like to take a look at the back side of it and kind of give it a visual and then ensure that it really is seated as far as it'll go. And then we'll do the same thing for the outer race. Use a smaller diameter tool. And something else you can do is take a small inspection mirror and a bright flashlight, poke it down inside there, and then you can see the back side of the bearing race. That way you can ensure that it is totally seated. And I've cleaned up the inside of the brake drum again. I'll slip that out of the way there, and then take my bearing repack tool, slide the bearing down over it, take some grease and fill up this cavity in the middle. That way we're not using a bunch of excess grease out of our grease gun to fill up that cavity. And then we'll just take a look at that bearing and make sure that it's mostly centered on the cone. Squirt a couple pumps of grease and then take a look at it. It still needs more grease. You'll be able to see the grease come out of the bottom of the bearing. Which it's doing now. I'm using a small stick of wood. Smear a bunch of grease inside here. You can kind of see it there. And when I pull my bearing out, I want to rotate the inner ring and the outer cage. It's kind of tricky to do because the grease creates a lot of friction and resistance. Just smear a bunch of grease around the outside as well. thing I like to do is kind of fill the back side of the bearing cavity, and I always cover up my seal with the towel. This was a 2x6 and it's so old and dry it's split in half. What works really good as a 2x4. So we'll flip the drum over. And I'll try to work some of this grease back down on top of the bearing inside of there. And I will also jam some in the outer race. And once you have your outer bearing packed with grease and have some grease in the hub for that outer bearing, you can go ahead and reinstall the hub. And a lot of this grease that I packed in works its way towards the outside, so I kind of try to work it back in there. And what happens is some of that grease comes back out when we install the bearing. And I have a big crescent wrench that I use. We'll tighten that as we rotate the hub. This brake is kind of tight. I think what I'll do is pull this drum hub assembly apart and try to loosen that brake. Okay, I've adjusted my brake and reassembled everything, so then I'll take my crescent wrench, tighten that nut as I rotate the hub. And then we'll kind of make the nut snug. Get the bearings seated. And then we'll leave the hub stationary. We'll back off that nut and then run the nut finger tight. And with this being a new set of bearings and races, it's not a bad idea to get this set. Take your trailer out, tow it around for a few miles, and then check the play and the bearings again and make another adjustment if necessary. With this style keeper clip, we just need to find the sweet spot where we can install it. I do feel just a little bit of play, so I'm going to try and tighten that just one more notch, one more location on this clip. Anyway, that's the general idea, is to get everything tight so there's no play in the bearings.